When drawing subjects from real life, it's really important to get the proportions right, but it's really difficult to do on a consistent basis if you're just relying on eyeballing the proportions. Now, when you're thinking about proportions, that's the spacing between different points on the drawing. If those spaces are the same as what you see from the real life object, then your drawing's going to be correctly proportioned. Now, how can you get those proportions right without using some sort of measuring device? Well, one tool that you can use to do that is triangulation. The Vitruvian Studio's Basics Drawing course, it covers triangulation in depth because this is such a useful tool. Now, the idea is that you've got 2 points, and if you have these 2 starting points and you draw 2 lines at the correct angle, where those 2 lines cross, you'll have a third point that is correct, and it's a correct recreation of what you're seeing. So you start with the most basic shape that you can draw with 3 lines, and that's a triangle. And so you are trying in these exercises to get these angles right, and it's actually a lot easier than just eyeballing it when you focus on first a starting point from the top line going down to the bottom. Then you've got 2 points that you know are correct, and they're in a correct relationship to each other. Then you draw 2 lines from those 2 points, and if you're getting the angles of those 2 lines right, that third point you make is going to be pretty close to the third point of the original that you're drawing. Now, the process for doing this, you do it in phases. As you can see here, you start by drawing these rough, kind of soft lines, and they cover sort of a range of possible angles, but then you roll the eraser over the top of those rough lines, and then you come over that with a harder lead pencil, and you draw the lines in more darkly. And as you're drawing the lines in more darkly, you're getting more precise about the angle. So you start with something that's rough and fuzzy and end up with something that's sharp and dark. And if you do it right, then you are reproducing what you see more accurately than if you just started out and just tried to draw the line and gave one go at it. This process of revision is really useful. Now, when you go through this process, you have several different tools that you're using. You're starting with a fairly soft pencil lead at first, an HB pencil lead. That'll help you give those soft lines. And then you're using a moldable eraser that doesn't produce crumbs, and you roll that over the top. And then you use a little bit harder pencil on the second go around, and that's usually a 2H pencil in this exercise. And so you go over it once, and then you have your fine point eraser that does produce crumbs, and you sort of erase out the blurriness and just leave behind the one thick line. The final step is to go over the thinner, finer line with an even harder lead, and that's usually a 4H lead. And when you do that, you get a much more precise, highly defined line than what you started out with. And you do that over and over, and eventually you get the hang of triangulation to the point where you can move on to more complex shapes. With these more complex shapes, you've got more than just 3 points, but you're still using triangulation to locate those points. So you're drawing some intermediate triangles throughout the shape to locate those points, and then you're connecting the points with kind of rough, fuzzy lines again. Then you're making those lines progressively sharper and darker. Now, this is definitely a challenge in several respects. There are definitely tips that are shared by the Vitruvian instructor, and I definitely encourage you to sign up for the course and get those tips. But one thing that I noticed is that with bigger shapes and longer stretches, it's easy for my lines to stop being straight and start to become more curved. I think that's just because of the way our bodies are built. Our arm is connected to a joints, and so you want to rotate around those joints, your elbow and your shoulder, your wrist, and so they kind of move in an arc just naturally. And so to make them straight requires adjustment all throughout the line. And so making perfectly straight lines can be tricky. Using points that you're aiming at is helpful to get it more straight, but as I step back from the pictures, I realize that the curves kind of creep in when I'm not intending for the line to be curved. You can see in these little glimpses that I'm also using a pair of dividers here, because all throughout this you're using triangulation to locate these points, and you can use the divider to compare the original shape to the shape that you're drawing to see if you've got the spacing correct. But the trick is not to rely on the dividers as a measuring tool from the outset. You just use it to test yourself, use it to test your triangulation method, because normally you're not going to have your subject printed out on paper right next to your drawing. You're going to be looking at something in real life, like a model or landscape or whatever, and you're not going to be able to use your dividers on that. So this is just kind of an intermediate tool right now to check yourself as you're learning the method. Now, it's really funny because as I was focusing on the little minute details of each drawing, I would think that I've got them right, and I would go back and forth measuring the angle by holding my pencil up in front of one of my eyes with the other one closed, and I'd think that I'd have the angle right, and then I'd draw it, and then I'd go back and compare, and I'd be off. And so it's really easy for you to fool yourself, trick yourself into thinking that you're pretty close, and eyeballing it just isn't sufficient. At the same time, triangulation is not precise. We just don't have the ability with these types of tools and using a free hand to make it exactly precise. And the bigger the shapes get, the more these inaccuracies sort of compound. But I think over time I was getting better at it. Like I had fewer instances where I was just way off, but almost every time I was a little bit off on my first try locating a point. And so I did rely on the dividers a lot to make sure that I was staying on track. But just like with the triangles, I found that this method of triangulation, even on more complex shapes, it really was way better than what I would have been able to do if I had just looked at the shape and tried to draw it freehand by just kind of looking back and forth. Using these intermediate methods, drawing those triangulation lines inside and then erasing them away, I was getting a lot closer to the original than I would have otherwise. And on these big shapes, it was starting to become clearer how this would become the basis of a blocking in of a real drawing. That's something that the instructor explains, is that these shapes that are kind of just random, they really can correspond to the arrangement of different objects within a composition. Like a still life painting can have various points: the top of a vase, the bottom of an apple, the end point of a flower stem, and you translate those into points. You get those points properly spaced, and you're well on your way to having a properly proportioned, accurate recreation of the original composition. So this is not just a waste of time to start with these really basic geometric shapes. Once you get the straight line shapes down, then the course moves into some curved line shapes. The thing that makes these curvy shapes more challenging than the straight line shapes that preceded them is that the straight line shapes have the points that you need to reproduce already there. The corners are the points, but the curve doesn't have any corners, and so you have to come up with your own points. And so you look at sort of the extremes. You look at the highest point and the lowest point. You look at the point that's farthest to the left, the point that's farthest to the right, and then you start creating some straight line shapes that are an envelope sort of around, sort of within the curved shape. And when you get that straight shape, you can then start to work curves that are oriented around the points of that initial straight line shape, if that makes any sense. Uh, as you can see here, like that pear shape, I start out with kind of a diamond shape, and then to make the curve itself is made up of small straight lines that are at various angles that try to match the basic curvature, and then you smooth that out over these iterations. You start with fuzzy, soft lead, and then you eventually sharpen those lines up with the harder leads. And again, I'm using the dividers throughout to get the proportions right, or at least close to right. So each succession in difficulty here is just adding one skill on top of another, and they all build on each other to the point where you're able to make something that really is pretty tricky if you were just to try it freehand. But when you break it down step by step like this, it takes a lot of the mystery out of it, at least for me. Now, there are still some points here where even the instructor admits that triangulation isn't going to get you 100% of the way there just because it doesn't provide enough precision, but it'll get you a lot of the way there. And that little bit of extra, that's where the talent and also, I think more importantly, the muscle memory of developing curves and creating curves that match what your mind wants to make, that just comes with practice. And so that's why the course has you do many shapes. This is all sped up quite a bit, probably 20 times faster than normal speed. And I spent over 40 hours over the course of several weeks working on this. And looking at it now, I can see so many points where I could have done better. But really, I just try to keep encouraging myself, like giving myself little pep talks and saying, this isn't too bad. This is, better than it was before, and identifying the spots where, oh, you know what, I did make that a little too wide. You know what, I could have done another check here. I could have formed this curve a little more carefully, paying a little bit more attention to the original. I think all of that shows you that you're making progress, and it's not a hopeless endeavor. You'll see as I'm filling this in, trying to make these curves, I felt like I was getting faster at the process, but I didn't want to get careless with it. And the shapes also, they vary so much, these skinny ones, fat ones, some of them start to curve back on themselves and have little hook shapes almost. All of these are sort of mini bumps in challenge between the other major bumps, going from triangles to straight line shapes to now these curve shapes. You've also got variations in the types of shapes. And by the end of it, you feel like you can tackle pretty much any sort of curved shape and at least get it close, a lot closer than you could have otherwise. I am a little nervous about my reliance on the tools, though. The dividers are really helpful to make sure that you're getting things close to right and that you're not getting too far off. You're not getting too deceived by your own eye and your own perception. So when I'm no longer able to rely on the dividers, I think that'll be another jump in difficulty. I'm also getting, as I go through these exercises, a greater appreciation for the different pencil types, like the lead hardness, the difference between HB, 2H, and 4H. You really start to get a feel for how the different lead behaves. Just even things as basic as you have to sharpen the HB pencil a lot more because it's wearing down a lot faster. But you also, you get the sense that, okay, this harder lead will give me a finer point, but it won't make it extra dark. You'll get about the same level of darkness, but you're able to get a finer, sharper point without making it darker. These are all things that I had never learned about before, and it's really helpful to just learn this by doing an actual exercise with the tools rather than hearing it explained to you as a theoretical matter. And it helps me understand better why artists might have a whole variety of different pencils. There really are different purposes for the different hardness of lead and all these other specialized tools like this fine point eraser. Such a great tool, really helpful. Just using the little pink eraser on the end of a yellow school pencil can't get you that kind of fine-grained detail. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that. Just this chance to learn more about how these different drawing tools work and how to put them to use. I'll also mention that I listen to music while I am doing the drawing, and I know the instructor suggested that you just focus on not having any sort of distraction like music playing or talking to anybody else, but I find that the music helps turn off one analytical part of my mind and helps me to open up just the other side that's just perceiving and recreating. And so it also makes the time go by a little faster, and it makes the whole practice session seem a little bit more like play. So, do what works for you. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'm looking forward to the next lesson. I'd also love to hear your thoughts and questions, so please feel free to put those in the comments. Take care.